November 1942. A naval operations room in Truk Lagoon. The air is heavy with humidity and cigarette smoke. Maps of the Pacific cover the walls, marked with red grease pencil lines and carefully placed wooden ship markers. Japanese officers stand in silence as a report is read aloud. An American aircraft carrier, again, has been detected operating east of the Solomon Islands. That carrier was supposed to be gone. Weeks earlier, pilots had reported it burning. Damage assessments had been filed. Intelligence summaries had confidently listed it as sunk or rendered combat ineffective. The arithmetic of war had been clear. Carriers were rare, irreplaceable instruments. Lose one, and the balance shifts permanently. Yet here it was, alive, launching aircraft, moving at speed. No one speaks at first. The room absorbs the implication slowly, uneasily. This is not a tactical problem. It is something deeper, something unsettling. If an American carrier could be destroyed or believed destroyed and then return as if untouched, then the assumptions underpinning Japan's entire naval strategy were flawed. Outside, the Pacific War continues its relentless motion. Aircraft take off, radios crackle, engines turn. And in that quiet room, a realization begins to form. This enemy does not fight the way Japan expected. And that realization will soon become impossible to ignore. To understand why the reappearance of American aircraft carriers caused such unease inside the Japanese Navy, it is necessary to step back, before Pearl Harbor, before the smoke over Oahu, before the Pacific became a battlefield, and examine how Japan understood naval war itself. For decades, the Imperial Japanese Navy had been shaped by a single guiding idea, Kantai Kessen, the doctrine of the decisive battle. War, as Japan envisioned it, would not be a long struggle of attrition. It would be a carefully managed sequence of engagements designed to thin an enemy fleet before delivering a final annihilating blow. This belief was not abstract. It was rooted in history. In 1905, at the Battle of Tsushima, the Japanese fleet had destroyed Russia's Baltic fleet in a single decisive engagement. The lesson drawn from that victory was profound and enduring. If the enemy's main force could be lured across vast distances, weakened along the way, and then destroyed in one climactic battle, the war would effectively be over. That logic shaped everything. Japanese ship design emphasized speed, striking power, and long-range weapons. Battleships carried massive guns. Cruisers were optimized for night fighting. Torpedoes, especially the Type 93 Long Lance, were engineered to strike from unexpected distances. Aircraft carriers, though recognized as important, were still seen primarily as tools to prepare the battlefield for the decisive surface action. Above all, the doctrine assumed finite fleets. Ships were expensive. Construction took years. Trained crews took even longer to develop. Losses were expected to be permanent. In this mental framework, sinking an enemy capital ship was not merely a tactical success, it was a strategic victory that permanently altered the balance of power. When Japan looked across the Pacific at the United States, it saw a potential adversary that was wealthy but complacent. American society appeared fragmented, individualistic, and politically divided. Japanese planners believed that the United States lacked the stomach for prolonged sacrifice. If Japan could strike hard at the outset, destroying battleships, crippling carriers, seizing territory quickly, the Americans would negotiate rather than endure years of costly war. This belief was not limited to politicians. It permeated naval intelligence, pilot training, and operational planning. Carrier warfare, still relatively new in the late 1930s, was interpreted through this same lens. Carrier islands were seen as powerful but fragile. They were floating airfields, vulnerable to fire, explosion, and catastrophic damage. A well-placed bomb or torpedo could render one useless. And if a carrier was rendered useless, it was effectively removed from the war. Japanese pilots were trained accordingly. They were taught to identify enemy carriers quickly, strike decisively, and report damage with confidence. A carrier on fire was considered a carrier lost. A carrier listing or withdrawing at speed was assumed to be finished. This mindset was reinforced during the early months of the Pacific War. Pearl Harbor appeared to validate everything Japan believed about American vulnerability. Battleships lay shattered in shallow water. American naval aviation seemed unprepared. In the months that followed, Japanese forces advanced rapidly through the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, encountering resistance that often collapsed faster than expected. Carrier battles at Coral Sea and Midway introduced new complexities, but even there, Japanese pilots reported heavy American losses. Smoke, fire, and explosions were interpreted as destruction. Reports flowed upward, often optimistic, sometimes exaggerated, but rarely questioned. And why would they be? In the Japanese naval worldview, no nation could casually absorb such losses. No system could replace capital ships quickly. No fleet could lose carriers and simply continue operating as if nothing had happened. That assumption, deeply ingrained, rarely challenged, set the stage for the shock that was to come. Because while Japan was fighting a war based on the mathematics of scarcity, the United States was preparing to fight a very different kind of war. And the gap between those two visions was about to reveal itself, quietly at first, and then all at once. While the Imperial Japanese Navy built its strategy on the assumption that major naval losses were irreversible, the United States was preparing, often unconsciously, for war in which losses would be absorbed, repaired, and replaced at a pace few outside America fully understood. This difference didn't begin with the war. It was structural. Long before December 1941, the United States possessed the largest industrial economy in the world. Its shipyards stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Steel production dwarfed that of any other nation. Electrical power was abundant. Rail networks moved raw materials inland and finished products back to the coasts with mechanical regularity. These were not military achievements. They were civilian systems that could be converted to war with alarming speed. American naval planners didn't expect carriers to be invulnerable. On the contrary, they assumed damage was inevitable. What mattered was survivability and recovery. Ships were designed with redundancy, multiple engine rooms, layered fire suppression systems, compartmentalization that could keep a vessel afloat even after severe hits. Damage control was not an afterthought. It was drilled, rehearsed, institutionalized. Equally important was geography. Pearl Harbor, though badly damaged in the attack, remained operational. West Coast shipyards, Bremerton, Mare Island, Puget Sound, San Diego, had enormous capacity. Floating dry docks could be towed forward. Repair ships followed fleets. A damaged carrier did not vanish from the war. It entered a pipeline. The United States also thought in terms of rotation, not finality. A carrier might be withdrawn, repaired, refitted, and returned under the same name or a new one within months. From the American perspective, a carrier battle was not a one-time exchange. It was part of a continuous cycle of operations. This philosophy extended to intelligence management. American commanders understood that enemy assessments were imperfect. They knew Japanese pilots tended to overclaim successes, particularly in the chaos of air combat. Smoke and fire were visible. Structural damage was not. American naval intelligence quietly allowed Japan to believe carriers had been sunk, when in reality they were damaged but recoverable. This was deception, not in the theatrical sense. It was systemic ambiguity. Radio silence, limited sightings, strategic withdrawals timed to reinforce enemy assumptions. Then there was production. Even as early carrier battles were being fought, American shipyards were already launching new vessels. The Essex-class carriers, larger and more durable than their predecessors, were under construction in numbers that Japanese planners had not anticipated. Each one represented not just a ship, but a philosophy, that losses were acceptable if replacement was assured. Japanese intelligence struggled to grasp this scale. Reports of new American carriers were often dismissed as misidentifications. How could the United States produce carriers faster than Japan could sink them? How could a nation supposedly unprepared for war sustain such output? Inside the Imperial Japanese Navy, questions began to surface, quietly at first. After Coral Sea,
After Midway, after the early Solomon Islands battles, sightings did not match expectations. Carriers thought destroyed appeared again. Air groups reconstituted. Strike capacity did not decline the way Japanese planners believed it should. What had once been dismissed as error began to look like a pattern. And patterns in war are dangerous things. They suggest not bad luck, but flawed assumptions. They hint that the enemy is operating under rules you do not fully understand. By late 1942, Japan was still fighting aggressively. Its pilots were experienced. Its ships were formidable. But beneath the surface, something fundamental was shifting. The war was no longer aligning with the numbers Japan had calculated. And soon that miscalculation would stop being theoretical and start becoming undeniable. The first cracks did not appear in...
The moment when doubt hardened into certainty did not arrive with a single battle. It emerged through repetition. Again and again, American carriers appeared where Japanese planners believed they should not exist. The pattern became unmistakable during the prolonged struggle for the Solomon Islands in late 1942 and early 1943. This was not a brief clash. It was a grinding campaign of attrition, fought across sea lanes, airfields, and jungle-covered islands, and it was here that the limits of Japanese assumptions were exposed in full view. After the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August 1942, Japanese air crews reported heavy damage to American carriers. Fires had been observed, flight decks were obscured by smoke, bomb hits were claimed. The assessments filtered upward and were recorded with confidence. American carrier strength, it was believed, had been meaningfully reduced. Yet weeks later, American airstrikes continued with the same intensity. At the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands in October, Japanese pilots again inflicted severe damage. The USS Hornet was struck repeatedly and eventually abandoned. This time there was no ambiguity. A carrier had been destroyed. Japanese confidence surged. Losses had been heavy, but the exchange appeared favorable. And still, the Americans did not withdraw. Carriers previously damaged returned to action. Others arrived to take their place. Air groups appeared well-trained, well-coordinated, and relentless. The tempo of American operations did not slacken in the way Japanese planners expected after carrier losses. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, this was the inflection point. Carrier warfare had been expected to function like a ledger. Losses entered, totals reduced, capacity diminished. But the ledger refused to balance. The numbers no longer told a reassuring story. Inside operational headquarters, planners began recalculating force estimates. How many American carriers were actually operational? How many had been sunk? How many were damaged but repairable? The answers varied depending on who was asked. There was no clarity, only widening uncertainty. That uncertainty bled into decision-making. Japanese commanders hesitated to commit forces fully, unsure whether American carrier strength had truly been reduced. Aggressive plans were tempered by caution. Opportunities passed without exploitation. The initiative, once seized with confidence, began to slip away. At sea, the consequences were visible. Japanese air crews flew longer missions with fewer experienced leaders. Losses mounted. Training standards dropped out of necessity. Meanwhile, American carrier groups rotated crews, rested pilots, and returned with refreshed units. The disparity in endurance grew more obvious with each engagement. What made this realization especially painful was its inevitability. Even when Japanese pilots achieved tactical success, even when bombs hit their targets and carriers burned, the strategic outcome remained unchanged. The Americans returned, always. By early 1943, it became clear that Japan was not eroding American power at a sustainable rate. The attrition was asymmetric. Japanese losses were permanent, American losses were temporary. This was not something that could be solved with better tactics or greater bravery. It was arithmetic, industrial arithmetic, and it pointed in only one direction. Still, the full weight of that truth had not yet been acknowledged openly. Official doctrine did not change overnight. Hope lingered that a decisive engagement might yet occur, that one final battle might restore balance. But that hope depended on a belief that was rapidly collapsing, that American carriers, once destroyed, stayed destroyed. And that belief was about to be shattered completely. The final collapse of illusion came not with surprise, but with repetition so consistent it could no longer be explained away. By mid-1943, Japanese naval intelligence was forced to confront a pattern that contradicted every pre-war assumption. American carrier task forces were operating continuously across the Central and South Pacific. They appeared off New Guinea, in the Solomons, near the Gilberts. They struck, withdrew, and returned again, sometimes within weeks. There were too many of them. Reports arrived describing carriers with different silhouettes, different flight deck arrangements, unfamiliar island superstructures. These were not repaired ships. These were new ships, larger, more heavily armed, more capable. The Essex-class carriers, long rumored, were now arriving in operational strength. For Japanese planners, this marked the true turning point. It was one thing to believe damaged carriers could be repaired. It was another to realize that even sunk carriers were being replaced faster than Japan could destroy them.
The strategic consequences were immediate. Japanese carrier doctrine depended on concentrated power. With limited numbers, carriers had to be preserved, committed only when conditions favored decisive results. But American carriers did not operate under the same constraints. They could maintain pressure across multiple fronts simultaneously. Losses in one area did not require strategic retreat. Another task force simply filled the gap. This shattered the logic of attritional victory. The Imperial Japanese Navy had entered the war believing that the United States would be forced to husband its carriers carefully. Instead, Japan found itself facing an enemy that accepted losses as a cost of doing business. Carriers were risked aggressively because they could be replaced. For Japanese commanders, this realization altered everything. Defensive planning replaced offensive ambition. The Navy began to conserve what remained of its carrier force. Training pipelines were shortened, air groups were rushed to the front with minimal preparation. Veteran pilots, once carefully preserved, were now expended in increasingly desperate efforts to blunt American advances. The psychological shift was profound. Where earlier engagements had been approached with confidence, later ones were marked by fatalism. Pilots flew knowing that even success might change nothing. Commanders issued orders aware that the enemy would return regardless of outcome. The sense of fighting a finite opponent was gone. This realization did not immediately end Japanese resistance. Wars rarely collapse all at once, but it altered the internal calculus of the Imperial Navy. Strategy became reactive. Initiative passed irrevocably to the Americans. From this point forward, Japanese carriers would fight not to win the war, but to delay its end. Every sortie became a holding action, every engagement an attempt to trade time for diminishing returns. The American carrier force, meanwhile, expanded relentlessly. Each new task group represented not just ships and aircraft, but proof that the war had entered a phase Japan could not control. The shock was no longer theoretical, it was operational, and it marked the moment when the Pacific War ceased to be a contest of maneuver and became a demonstration of industrial supremacy. With that realization came consequences that extended far beyond the flight deck, into strategy, morale, and the very survival of the Japanese fleet. Once the illusion of American vulnerability collapsed, the Imperial Japanese Navy found itself confronting a reality it had no practical means to change. By late 1943, Japanese strategy shifted decisively from offense to preservation. Carrier task forces that had once spearheaded advances now remained in port for extended periods, their movements cautious, their sorties increasingly rare. Fuel shortages compounded the problem, but fear of irreplaceable loss was just as decisive. Every carrier sortie now carries existential risk. There were no reserves to draw from, no rapid replacements waiting in shipyards. The Navy that had once sought a decisive battle now avoided one. This defensive posture had cascading effects. Pilots who might have gained experience in frequent operations instead remained idle, while those committed to combat were often rushed forward with inadequate training. The gap widened. American pilots accumulated hours, returned home, returned refreshed. Japanese pilots flew until they were killed. Morale suffered quietly but unmistakably. Officers understood the arithmetic even if they did not articulate it publicly. They knew that American losses did not translate into lasting advantage. They knew that each Japanese carrier lost represented years of work that could not be replaced. This knowledge shaped every operational decision, constraining initiative and encouraging caution at precisely the moment when boldness was needed. At the same time, American carrier doctrine evolved rapidly. Task forces became larger, more flexible, and more integrated. Radar coordination improved. Anti-aircraft fire grew denser. Fighter direction became increasingly sophisticated. Each engagement not only preserved American strength, but improved it. Combat experience fed directly into training and design. Japanese planners watched this evolution with growing alarm. Attempts to counter American carrier dominance through night attacks, massed airstrikes, and later special attack units represented desperation rather than confidence. These methods imposed losses, but they did not solve the underlying problem. The Americans absorbed damage, adapted, and returned. By the end of 1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy was fighting a fundamentally different war than the one it had planned. The decisive battle had not occurred. Instead, Japan faced a grinding contest of endurance against an opponent whose endurance appeared limitless. And the longer the war continued, the more stark the imbalance became. What had begun as disbelief turned into resignation. The Navy continued to fight because it had no alternative, but it no longer expected that sinking American carriers would bring relief. They would come back. By 1944, the consequences of that realization were visible across every level of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Carrier air groups no longer represented elite striking forces. They had become fragile collections of undertrained pilots flying increasingly obsolete aircraft. Fuel rationing limited flight hours. Spare parts were scavenged from damaged planes. Entire squadrons existed largely on paper, their aircraft grounded to preserve dwindling resources. American carriers, meanwhile, multiplied. The Essex-class carriers entered service in rapid succession, each one larger, more protected, and more capable than the last. Light carriers supplemented them. Escort carriers extended air cover across vast distances. Where Japan struggled to keep a single task force operational, the United States deployed overlapping formations that ensured continuous presence. The psychological effect was devastating. Japanese naval officers reported a sense of inevitability settling over the fleet. Engagements were no longer approached as opportunities to win, but as obligations to fulfill. Orders emphasized delay rather than destruction. Every day the Americans' advance was a day closer to home islands, closer to an outcome few believed could be prevented. The Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands in June 1944 made this realization unmistakable. Japanese carrier aviation, already weakened, was effectively annihilated in what American pilots would later call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft were lost from minimal American damage. The carriers themselves survived, but without air groups they were hollow vessels, unable to project power. From that point forward, the Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to function as an effective carrier force. What remained was an attempt to use ships as bait to lure American carriers into range of land-based aircraft or surface forces. This strategy culminated at Leyte Gulf, where the last Japanese carriers were deliberately sacrificed to divert American attention. They succeeded tactically, but only because American strength was so overwhelming that it scarcely mattered. After Leyte, Japan had no carrier aviation left to speak of. The Americans, in contrast, emerged with more carriers than they had begun the year with. Losses were repaired, damaged ships returned to service, new hulls joined the fleet. The cycle repeated relentlessly: damage, repair, return. For Japan, there was no return. The war's outcome was no longer in doubt, only its duration remained uncertain. And as American carrier task forces closed in on the home islands, the question was no longer whether Japan could stop them, but how much of the nation would survive the attempt. That question would define the final phase of the Pacific War. The shock felt by the Imperial Japanese Navy when American carriers returned from apparent destruction was not merely tactical, it was existential. It revealed a truth that no amount of bravery or discipline could erase. Japan had entered a war defined not by single battles, but by systems, by industrial depth, logistical resilience, and the capacity to absorb loss without losing momentum. In such a war, sinking ships was not enough. One had to eliminate the ability to replace them. Japan never possessed that capability. American carriers embodied this reality. They were not just warsorts, they were expressions of an economy mobilized at full scale. Behind every carrier stood shipyards working around the clock, training pipelines producing pilots faster than they could be lost, and supply chains capable of sustaining fleets thousands of miles from home. Damage did not signify defeat, it signified a temporary interruption. For Japan, damage was final. The return of American carriers after supposed destruction shattered the belief in a decisive blow. It replaced confidence with caution, initiative with hesitation. Once that psychological shift occurred, the strategic outcome became inevitable. The Imperial Japanese Navy continued to fight with courage and professionalism, but it did so under the weight of a realization it could not escape. Wars are often remembered for their climactic battles, yet history is more frequently decided by quieter truths, by which side can endure, adapt, and return stronger after every blow. The Pacific War demonstrated this with brutal clarity. When American carriers came back, again and again, they carried more than aircraft, they carried proof. Proof that modern warfare belongs to nations